The best of money matters. Under the radar.
You're listening to Money FM 89.3, and it's now time for a special in the community episode of Under the Radar with me, Chua Tian Tian. Now, earlier this year, we shared with you that we will be bringing you topical interviews with key leaders in the business world. So, housed under the Radar specials banner, these interviews are B2B focused and are meant to drive greater conversations in the business community. So now I'm fulfilling the promise we made by launching our first in the community episode, and we're going to kickstart the subsegment by looking at a corporate role that emerged only in the later half of the 20th century. Now, if you're familiar with the army or even war movies, you might have heard of a title or a rank called the Chief of Staff. Now, this term typically refers to a high-ranking officer or a leader in an organization that serves as an aide to a commander. Now, in the corporate world, a Chief of Staff is usually the bridge between the CEO charting out the strategic direction of the firm, as well as teams ensuring the smooth running of day-to-day operations in the company. But what exactly is the Chief of Staff? How senior is the Chief of Staff in the corporate ladder? Why are Chief of Staffs needed, and what exactly does it take to become one? Well, we seek to find out the answers to these questions by speaking to two individuals, one a Chief of Staff at a venture studio and the other a Chief of Staff at a global banking institution. Well, joining me right here in the studio is Ely Loa, Chief of Staff at xcube.co, and Geraldine Yip, Chief of Staff at HSBC Singapore. Welcome both to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great to have you. And let's start with the basics, Ely and Geraldine. McKinsey said the role of the Chief of Staff, specifically to CEOs, came about in the later half of the 20th century. The term previously was commonly associated with the military, with governments. So when did the term Chief of Staff begin to filter through to the corporate world? Who do Chief of Staff advise, say CEOs, C-suite executives, MDs, board chair people? Maybe we could start with you, Ely.
Yeah, sure. So from my observation and from the peers that I get to learn from the other Chief of Staff, I think I can speak from the technology startup angle. So I think this Chief of Staff role only came about probably in the past 4 to 5 years. Yeah, and most of the Chief of Staff that I know, yes, they serve CEO or C-suite in a company, but I'm also seeing some Chief of Staff, they are serving regional heads in bigger corporations, or for example, like Big Four consulting firm, they also hire Chief of Staff for their regional heads or function heads. Yeah.
And what about you, Geraldine?
So in the corporate world, I think specifically in banking, I think the role started to exist probably in the mid-2000s, I think. Like you could see large international banks that had chief of staff roles in various in places within the organization, mostly supporting business heads and the C-suite. So I would say that's probably when it started.
Okay. Now, the Chief of Staff role, it is commonly said to be the bridge between strategy and execution. Strategy at a C-suite level and execution, of course, at the ground level, as opposed to the common misconception that it refers to a quote-unquote glorified executive assistant. How would you define the role of a Chief of Staff then, going to you, Geraldine?
Not only is it not a glorified executive assistant, but sometimes people think chief of staff means like head of HR, which is not.
True.
The role actually is it spans strategy execution, right? So it depends on where the role is positioned within the organization and who you're supporting in that organization. But yeah, it definitely is what I refer to as an enabling role. It's all about supporting the C-suite and most likely the CEO in executing what he has to do. So it's about alignment and helping to drive efficiency.
Yeah, so I will quote what my CEO often described me to other people. So he often describes me as an orchestrator for our organization. Yeah, so it's about orchestrating the right people and right processes to get the right things done. at all time. Yeah, so I think for chief of staff, most of us, we are actually the connecting tissue between vision and execution, like Geraldine mentioned. So other than strategic planning, strategic discussion, I think the execution it's an important part for chief of staff.
And that leads me to my next question, which is why are COSs or chiefs of staff needed? Is the chief of staff basically a very senior member of a company that's so familiar with the operations and the intricacies that it can help the C-suites? Because C-suites periodically change, the COS can keep them abreast of key issues so that they can make strategic decisions while being fully informed of the intricacies, the people relationship within the company and the organization.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it definitely is positioned to be that way, right? But you also often hear about chiefs of staff who move on when the principal moves on, right? Their principal moves on. But for sure, the institutional knowledge that the chief of staff has and is able to build fairly quickly in their role, because of the way it's positioned, because of the exposure that they have, because of their need to navigate the organization to get things done, that definitely is an advantage and a good way to maintain consistency through leadership changes.
Yeah, so in many ways, the chief of staff plays I would say a stabilizing role while also accelerating the momentum for the business.
And if I may, pose this follow-up question to you, Geraldine, how are chiefs of staff appointed in a corporate structure, maybe like in a banking institutions? Are these people formerly from operations, very familiar with operations? Are they from finance or strategy, or do they come in with the C-suites, as you mentioned earlier?
So it really is a mixture, I mean, in terms of the type of background that the chief of staff may have, because the truth is there is no chief of staff skill set. There are things that help a chief of staff be a better chief of staff, definitely types of development or types of skills, but, there's really no technical background that makes you a better chief of staff. So some people are more, I would say, finance-driven. Some people are more strategy-driven. Some people are more communications-driven. And then, of course, some people are more operational. So it's really a combination of these things. And the chief of staff that is chosen for a principal, I would say, really depends on the principal. It really depends on whether they're looking for someone who has a very complementary skill set to themselves. So some C-suites look for someone who doesn't have the skills that they have themselves because they figure, the combination of the two is what makes you a powerful combination. So I would say that definitely how the role comes about. Some people advertise for the role, but some principals obviously already know who would be a good partner for them. So they just reach out directly.
I see. Then in that case, Geraldine and Ely, feel free to jump in as well. Where do chiefs of staff fit in the corporate structure? How are they compensated in the jobs market then?
I think for the current jobs market, I can see most of the chiefs of staff, they are compensated at least the director level because they act as the strategic advisor and strategic partner to their principal. And they are given high level of autonomy to make some decisions for the business and on behalf of their principal sometimes. So it actually comes with big responsibilities. Yeah, so most of the chiefs of staff are compensated, I think, comparable to a senior level role in both corporates and also in the technology space.
Yeah, I would agree. And in a larger organization, it is a little bit aligned to, I guess, in a way, the scope of the business that you support and the size of the business. In a larger organization, we find that there are people who may not carry the official chief of staff title, but they are doing chief of staff type work for their business heads. So every business head may not have an official chief of staff, but they will have someone on their team who definitely does chief of staff type work. And that person is definitely may not be, say, as senior as the person that runs the sales team or the person that runs the product team, but will definitely also be a part of that inner circle of management.
Yeah, and I think if you hear people describing you as the right-hand person of this very senior leader, you are probably doing a chief of staff role.
But the thing is, if Elite, earlier you mentioned about how sometimes you act on behalf of the principal as well. Some chiefs of staff act on behalf of their principals. How do they not cut across different teams and overstep the different boundaries and the different responsibilities handled by the different, head of units, head of departments?
We spend a lot of time, or I, at least for myself, I can speak for myself, I spend a lot of time in building trust and relationship. So building trust not just between my principal and myself, but also across different functions in the business, as well as the external stakeholders. Yeah, because and another unique thing about the chief of staff role is we typically do not have any subordinates, or we don't manage a team under us. We mainly influence the main stakeholders in the business to move things forward together. Yeah, so I would say building trust and honor your promises and do the right things.
So it's all about the intricacies and the details. Yeah. Okay. And, Geraldine and Ely, let's talk about a day in your life as a chief of staff. The day-to-day responsibilities of a COS, what does it look like? What are your responsibilities? Is there a set structure, so to speak? What are the challenges then of being a chief of staff?
I would say that in my day-to-day, there are no 2 days that are really alike. But I do attend, like most people, a lot of meetings. I have to interact a lot. To Ely's point just now about how you make sure that, you don't overstep your role or things like that. It's all about communication and collaboration, I would say, right? And that requires, constant interaction and communication with people. And ideally in person, just because it is easier to build trust, right? When you build connection with people over time, and it's easier to do it in person. So it is something that I personally also spend a lot of time on, because navigating a complex organization like HSBC, not only locally but regionally, globally, is a very large place, is something that does take time, and sometimes you have to anticipate what's going to come up a little bit. I would say that, the challenges of the job really revolve around influencing without authority, right? Like to Ely's point, we don't have big teams working for us. So everything that you do is about trying to align people, getting them to prioritize something that may not be number one on their priority list, but, trying to share with them that it's important for the organization at large. So I would probably say that sometimes that negotiation, that navigation, trying not to, trying not to overstep your role is a lot of the day job.
If we were to look at a day in your life, right, what does it look like? What kind of meetings do you attend? Do you attend meetings relating to, I suppose it's not just one department, many departments, many geographies. How do you distill that down into what are the priorities for the firm and for your principal? What is next? How do you get things done then?
Yeah, like in a banking structure where I'm in, there are a lot of governance meetings that are already standard operating procedure. So those are already scheduled into the calendar and on a day-to-day basis. And then, of course, there are meetings that concern specific projects. So that takes up, depending on when the project needs to be closed, that becomes number one on your priority list. And then there are just the reality of the things that, the fires that burn on the day. So then at that point, your whole day gets taken over. So it does vary. But yeah, like there are definitely standard governance meetings that have to go in because they're regulated. And then there are just the normal management meetings. And then there are like I said, the project meetings for specific things that need to move forward.
Ely, what about you?
Yeah, so likewise, I agree. No 2 days are the same. Yeah, like today we are doing this interview, right? So same for me as well, it goes with the priorities. Some people might think as the chief of staff to our principal, we spend a lot of time with them on the day-to-day basis. It really depends. So there are days I see my CEO 5 minutes a day. There are also days we go on a business trip, a very intense business trip together, and we spend like 5 days in a row. Seeing each other every single day and many hours in a day. So it really depends on the business objective and the priorities during the point of time.
Now, Ely, you come from xcube, which is a corporate venture studio that helps corporations and entrepreneurs in innovation and venture building, more startup kind of environment. Geraldine, you come from HSBC. 2 companies, very different industries and very different skills. How do your roles differ in terms of scale, speed, structure, and governance then?
So at xcube, we are very fast-paced. We are also very lean and very entrepreneurial. So as the chief of staff at xcube, I have to be very, very resourceful because resource constraint, it's one of the unique thing about startup, right? So have to be very resourceful, very creative, and a lot of real-time decision making, small and big decisions. So so it's I guess it's very different from bigger organizations, but the core capability or core skill sets for chief of staff remain similar, I would say, other than influence all stakeholders, including internal, external stakeholders without actual authority. We also need to bring clarity under complexity, right? So as a younger company, smaller company, it doesn't mean the things that we do is not complex. The decision we are making, it's also for long-term, mid-term, long-term sometimes. I would say having good people skill is quite essential because you really have to align objectives and priorities and pull people together to achieve the goal.
What about you, Geraldine?
I think for me, the similarities of large and chief of staff roles in large and small organizations really lies around the fact that it is a complex external environment at the moment, right? So I think we're all making decisions in a VUCA world, right? And I think that is the challenge, everyday challenge of the job. Also the commonality in the jobs is really about the prioritization. You're constantly reprioritizing and prioritizing on behalf of your principal because you're trying to say, okay, which one is going to become, or you're trying to anticipate what might become a priority tomorrow. And so for me, that's the day-to-day thing that I'm constantly doing for the boss. I do think that also in a large organization, while I would say probably more resourcing than a small organization for sure, sometimes because of that, the complexity in the decision-making is more difficult, it's more challenging. And you're also working a lot with people who are not located in the same time zone as you. So the communication skills that have to cross those borders sometimes become a little bit more complicated. So I would say that, the downside of working for a large organization, it also means that there are other chiefs of staff that you have to deal with who are also doing the same thing that everyone's trying to do the right thing by their principal. So sometimes working in a large organization has definitely that complexity and downside occasionally.
I see. Now, if you're just tuning in, we're in conversation with Ely Loh, Chief of Staff at xcube.co, and Geraldine Yip, Chief of Staff at HSBC Singapore. So let's talk about what makes what makes a good Chief of Staff. What makes a good one versus a mediocre one? And how does a Chief of Staff drive transformation, alignment, and decision velocity within an organization? Could you share some examples?
A good Chief of Staff is someone who brings clarity, not just coordination of things. In the current age, right, being efficient is probably no longer enough. And you have to be also effective in aligning objectives and people for what matters the most for the business. In my personal view, for a great chief of staff, the distinction between a great chief of staff and a so-called a normal chief of staff is we have to be proactive. Yeah, we have to be very proactive in whether it's identifying blind spots for our principals, initiate and facilitate hard conversations, active listening, keeps the organization and the business moving without, I would say, constant instructions given by the principal or anyone. Yeah. So I give one example that probably most people won't think of, like how much do we actually do as a chief of staff and what kind of extra mile we are taking. So this came from actually one of my conversations with Geraldine. So we were talking about, how chief of staff actually look at the sitting plan for our CEO at the business lunch. Yeah.
So that's not just the duty of an executive assistant, because there are much more undertones, I suppose. Is that the case?
Yeah, that would be right. I mean, there's a lot of protocol, right, that goes around some of the formalities that our principals have to, undertake, like whether or not it might be a government or a political type lunch or, important clients, because what you're trying to do is make sure that the principal has the opportunity to have the right conversations. And sometimes you just have to help create those opportunities. Some things don't come just naturally, right? People think, he goes to a cocktail, and they're immediately going to meet and be able to have a conversation with that client. So in every room, there's a subtle hierarchy, right? And you've got to work out where you've got to work out where you've got to work out where your principal sits in that dynamic or that hierarchy. So I think that's what and you do this as just being part of the system, right? So I think a good chief of staff is one that has really achieved a lot, and no one really around them has realized that that has been negotiated and facilitated. It does make it challenging for the individual sometimes, because the recognition of that is not always seen. But definitely, I would say a good one is one that's able to do it. And hopefully, at the very least, the principal recognizes it, if no one else. Yeah.
So it can be something very intricate, something very small, but it's related to the strategy at large. And only the chief of staff is able to piece the jigsaw puzzles together.
Yeah.
So in that case, how do C-suite leaders, how do your principals, set up your KPIs and goals for you and for any other chief of staff?
In this case, I can only speak, I speak for myself as I say this. My personal KPIs are not particularly quantitative. It's hard to quantify the value that a chief of staff brings to the role, because obviously everything you're doing is an enabling or execution that already is being sitting either within a vertical or business that already has those quantified KPIs. For myself, mine lie around the value add of where I contribute to driving strategy execution, business development. So there's an element of my job that is very proactive, that I have to go out and search for partnerships and alliances in the market, build those relationships so that we're able to leverage on those as an organization. There's a piece around governance. I am also held accountable by the regulators. And then the last piece is just around public relations, media relations, actually government relations. So building and establishing an identity for HSBC in Singapore within the local community.
Any thoughts, Eli?
Yeah, so I would say yes, it's mostly qualitative over quantitative, because like Geraldine mentioned, it's really hard to quantify. I would say the closest thing you can think about is probably when the business achieved the strategic milestones, that we can take it as part of our achievements. But other than that, in xcube, normally how we review my performance is through one-on-one feedback, not only getting qualitative feedback from my principal, but also other important stakeholders in the business.
I will also say that within the strategy execution bucket of the KPIs, that would include, special projects. For example, there are one-off projects that sometimes the enterprise takes as a whole. It doesn't fall within any one of the business lines. And then if that's owned by the CEO office, then obviously that's an easy measurement because that one, the success and failure is with you. So that one's, for special projects, it can be clearly defined.
The thing about being a chief of staff, you are somewhat in a, lack of better words, no man's land because you don't belong to a certain department, so to speak. What is the career progression like for a chief of staff? Is, being a C-suite the next step in your career already? Are you seen as a successor to the principals that you work for? Do they see it that way as well?
In my organization, you're definitely not a successor to the CEO in my role. So that much I can tell you. But I think it depends on the technical skill set or the background that you yourself have.
Okay.
It's unlikely you grew up in my organization as a chief of staff. So it's unlikely that you started as a junior and just only did chief of staff work.
Yeah.
Chances are you have some sort of business experience.
Yes.
So in my case, for example, I have a marketing communications background. So, and that is what I spent the bulk of my career doing. I'd like to think that after this, going back and leading a marketing communications team in an organization is probably where I would go back to. So chances are I would go back to my technical skill set. I think a lot of chief of staff do eventually. There was one, for example, who worked for our group CEO. I think she was a lawyer by background and eventually went back to leading a legal function. So I think most people do, they have that opportunity to go back on the technical.
Yeah, and I think we are also seeing upcoming trends where some of the chiefs of staff they love their roles so much and they decided to become a career chief of staff. So they serve different principals throughout their career and they continue to do so and develop their career within the scope.
Okay. Now, this question, a very important one as well. We talked a lot about trust earlier, communications as well. Chiefs of staff, they are often seen as gatekeepers. You're close to the top leadership. You engage in confidential conversations with them. How do you then maintain trust upwards and also across operational teams and not be seen as gatekeepers given the information asymmetry among the strategic and the operational teams?
For me, I think active listening is important because some of the messages are actually not spoken. So
yes.
Many chief of staff are really good in interpreting communications, including
non-verbal,
hearing what is not said. Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm very aware, yes, sometimes people do see us as a gatekeeper. So how I overcome or remove, barriers for people when it comes to communication is to make sure I stay approachable. And being fair to the people that I work with, internally and externally. Whenever the circumstance permits, right, we try to be as transparent as possible and making sure that whenever we communicate an action plan, a strategic plan, we communicate the rationale behind it.
Yeah. Okay, what about you, Geraldine?
I would say the same thing, that essentially you are kind of a gatekeeper, but at the same time, if you remain accessible and approachable, that most people actually feel quite comfortable coming to you first, especially if you're offering good advice, good direction. So they feel confident that how you're telling them to approach something to get to help them achieve their goal, it's a partnership, right? Because sometimes, you also have to try and guide how to persuade the principal. So, so it helps to I think have that open and transparent, conversations about all this.
As we begin to wrap up the conversation, Ely and Geraldine, let's talk about advice for aspiring chiefs of staff. We've talked a lot about the role itself, but let's say someone is interested in becoming a chief of staff. How should he or she get started? What experience should these individuals get ready with them? How should they position themselves?
So I would say that it helps to be familiar with the organization that you're working for. So if you are, thinking about a chief of staff role, it is quite difficult to just go into a role where you're not familiar with the organization. However, if you're familiar with the principal, that helps as well. So I think that, when in your search or as you're networking, you got to figure out, is it the principal that you want to work for, or is it the organization you want to work for? Because that will help you kind of prioritize and view how you review these jobs. But it is definitely easier to make a transition within an organization because, like I said, you would normally come from one of the businesses where you already have business experience. So, in a role like this, that normally has a value attached to it, which helps you to get the role. So I would say that, definitely, but networking is definitely helpful. And then in a large organization like mine where they post all the jobs anyway, you kind of got to look out for them. And if you find yourself, taking a role where, for example, like I said, it may not be called chief of staff, but you may be able to do chief of staff type roles, that helps because then you build your experience doing that for someone and a business, and that helps you to build that expertise.
But as you mentioned, if Ely, I could pose this as well, they don't hire junior chief of staffs, right? They usually come with background in operations or in sales or in marketing for quite a number of years. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. And back to your question about suggestions or advice for aspiring chief of staff, right? I think two things they could possibly do. If they are looking for a role within the same organization, they can figure out what are the initiatives or activities that people are doing within the organization, but it's outside the current scope of their work. And they can volunteer, for example, volunteer to be in a committee, organizing committee for certain activities, or they can get involved in planning on some of the organizational-wise events. So that brings them some exposure and visibility to the higher up. That's one. Second, if someone wants to understand more about what a chief of staff does, because a lot of the things we do is actually invisible and behind the scenes. So I recently had someone approach me to ask me to be her mentor. So she's currently in executive assistant role, and she's thinking to progress into a chief of staff role. So she asked if I can mentor her and coach her, and I thought this is a good approach as well. So whether you want to explore the role within the same organization or outside the organization, other than networking, you probably can also identify, someone you see as a role model, and you can ask for support for the person to give you a little bit of time to mentor or coach you.
How do you transition from being an EA to a chief of staff? And I would suppose a steep learning curve. What does that transition look like?
I think it's a steep learning curve for any role to transition into a chief of staff. Yeah. So I can speak for myself. I was one of those examples. I was hired externally into xcube to become the chief of staff to my CEO. So I was the third team members he hired since the inception. I have to say it's a steep learning curve. So I identify myself as a generalist. So I have experiences in different functions, client success, marketing, revenue generation, commercial, and also I was running a big operation team in one of my previous jobs. Still, it's a steep learning curve for me because one unique thing about a chief of staff role is not just about doing the job, but also learning how to work with your principal. And every principal is different because they are human. So you need to spend time to I guess, create that relationship and nurture the relationship. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges of the job is definitely that you really have to try and put yourself in your principal's shoes and work out what are their challenges day to day, and then try and proactively anticipate how to overcome those challenges, right? But having an understanding of what the organization's trying to achieve from a business perspective, having an understanding of the business itself, that's the learning curve. So certainly for me, where I came from a certain type of corporate banking background, to learn about the retail business, the insurance business, all that is a learning curve. So some of that technicality is the challenge of the job.
And finally, one last closing remark before we let you both go. You know, we talked about the CoS role being a career accelerator, masterclass in leadership, and a window into the CEO's mindset. But any advice to those exploring the role or business leaders looking to hire for the role? What should they look out for?
So for me, it's really about communication, collaboration, adaptability. Someone who has empathy as a leading skill set, and enough of and confident enough to earn trust and build trust.
What about you, Ely?
So on top of what Geraldine mentioned, so backtrack a little bit, how Geraldine and I met, we actually met through a Chief of Staff Society. So it's a community of Chiefs of Staff in Singapore. Yeah, it's a very interesting one. So we discuss a lot of interesting topics within our Chiefs of Staff circle. And one common discussion that often come up from time to time is something we briefly mentioned earlier. So when we become a Chief of Staff, what comes after that? So so I think people need to think a little bit deeper into it, especially normally people, when someone wants to become a chief of staff, they already have certain level of achievements in their career. So very likely they are not having, let's say, only a 3 to 5 years experience, work experience. So they have good level of understanding about how business functions, and they have probably some aspiration for how they want to develop their career. So I think other than thinking what it takes to become a chief of staff, people should also think about what comes after that and whether it aligns with your career objectives. Yeah, and I also want to add, for businesses or business leaders who are thinking of or looking to hire a chief of staff, it's important to figure out, are you looking for someone who is complementing you, or you want someone who is the extension of you, that is your additional pair of eyes and ears. So you need to think through before you hire your chief of staff. And as an aspiring chief of staff, you need to think through what do you want in your career and what kind of business and what kind of principles you want to serve.
I see. Lots to think about indeed. Thanks so much, Ely and Geraldine, for joining us today. That was Ely Lua, Chief of Staff, xcube.co, and Geraldine Yip, Chief of Staff at HSBC Singapore. Thank you so much for joining us on Money FM 89.3.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Before acting on the information on Money FM, please consider if it's suitable for your own investment objectives, financial situation, and risk tolerance. To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.